Before the burnt people took over, my grandfather's homestead was an oasis of calm. The homestead was in the midst of the steppe, but neither forest nor mountains were far. My cousin and I spent most of our childhoods there. It was a good place for young boys to grow up. Our parents worked, the city was rough, and the old man could always use an extra pair of hands. We had free reign over the property, but our grandfather always warned us to not venture into the nearby forest. At night, by the light of the stove, he would tell us stories about a dark place of science which we were to avoid at all costs. He called it. Though tales of evil and corruption and the incomprehensible piqued our young interest, neither me nor my cousin disobeyed our grandfather's instructions. As long as we were obedient, the old man was kind. Neither of us were interested in seeing his anger. Though the prospect of a cursed science facility provoked all sorts of alluring vapors from our imagination, we kept ourselves satiated by playing with the massive turtles we'd find in the grass. After we finished our schooling, my cousin moved out west. He always had a mind for business and thought of himself as the next great global innovator. I, on the other hand, preferred a quieter life. For a couple of years, I worked in the city doing jobs not worth mentioning, and then, when the honking of cars and smell of smog got on my nerves, I moved back into the homestead to help care for the old man. As we grew older and wearier of fairy tales, my grandfather shifted his stories from the fantastical to practical warnings about drugs, guns, and affairs with married women. Yet, near the end of his life, confined to his bed, with me as his sole caretaker, the old man returned to speaking of... He pleaded with me, as if he could see the future in his fevered dreams, that both me and my cousin and anyone we cared for were to stay away from the forest. He also demanded that we never sell the property, lest it ends up in the hands of forces beyond the reach of man. At the time, I dismissed his words as the ramblings of an unwell mind. The funeral was a small, private affair for a quiet man who lived in solitude. There is much bureaucracy associated with properly burying the dead. It's in the various office waiting rooms that I made peace with my grandfather's passing. The funeral to me was but an end to the legal proceedings by then. As distant as the ceremony was to me, however, during the funeral repast, I found a familiar face that brought tears to my eyes. It was my cousin. He had traveled halfway across the globe to come pay his respects. Though we missed the burial, he stayed for the food. When I found out he had arrived straight from the airport and was yet to arrange his accommodation, I didn't ask. I insisted. My cousin would sleep in the guest house at the homestead. He was, after all, going to be inheriting half of it. My cousin was happy to accompany me out of town. He was curious about how my life had been over the past couple of years. He was also curious about the property. My cousin had made a name for himself out west. Initially, he worked for an import-export company that he quickly rose through the ranks of, and once he had accumulated enough capital, he started to invest. He had made a name for himself in stocks, and he was in the process of making an even bigger name for himself in the realm of cryptocurrency. Even though most of his money was tied up in the clouds, however, my cousin was curious about other investment opportunities. For the first week he stayed with me, my cousin didn't mention anything about developing the land. Occasionally he would bemoan the lack of Wi-Fi or hot water, but for the most part he would speak about the inherent tranquility of the homestead. He said people out west would pay good money to get away from the rumble of urban life to a place like this. It's not until a week into staying on the property that my cousin suggested we try setting up a business. I did not like the idea of developing the land at first, even when my cousin promised to shoulder all of the construction costs. I was resistant at first, but the man had a way with words. He also owned half of the property. The construction crew that worked on additional housing was beyond rowdy and tested my patience every step of the way. Yet when they set up the water boiler in the guest house, they bought my sympathies. Daily hot showers soothed my temper, and soon enough, I found myself amicable to the idea of the homestead being turned into a resort. As my cousin would say, we found much peace on the property when we were young. It would be a sin not to make some money off of sharing it. After about a year and a half, the housing my cousin had commissioned was completed. The cottages were humble, and my grandfather's old home was transformed into a relaxing communal area. Though the lodgings were nice and my cousin offered them for a bargain, we had trouble finding customers. My cousin had accrued a substantial amount of debt and was turning more agitated with every trip he took to the city. Apparently, along with the troubles with our new resort, his cryptocurrency portfolio had turned shaky. He floated the idea of selling the property, but he only did so once. On his following trip to the city, he returned with Batima. Batima said she could ensure our resort would be well booked and my cousin's financial woes would be fixed. I have met few people with piercings throughout my life, but if they were to gather all their jewelry in a pile, they wouldn't have even half of the metal Batima carried on her face. She dressed in garish, bright colors and constantly smoked and didn't inspire the smallest bit of confidence in me. Batima looked well out of place at our step resort, yet she was well versed in the art of the internet. Though I didn't know where to look whenever the two of us spoke, Batima kept her promise. Soon enough, the resort was turning a profit. Through social media and a couple of personal favors, Batima managed to bring our resort to the forefront of people's search results. After but a couple of weeks, we had various influencers from around the world come through our little resort and sing praises to their audiences, who in turn replicated their idol's pilgrimage. I would spend most of my time in my separated cottage, but whenever I walked through the lobby, Batima would be there. Sometimes she'd be working on her laptop, sometimes she'd be chatting with the guests and recommending hikes and other local attractions. We never spoke much. For months, Batima remained a stranger to me. Yet one morning, when two unexpected visitors showed up at the humble resort, I found an ally in her. They both wore lab coats and introduced themselves as Dr. Barrett and Professor Willow. Barrett was local, had a messy head of black hair, and seemed to be less talkative of the two. Willow towered over his colleague and led all the negotiations. When the man realized I couldn't properly understand him, he aimed all his communication at my cousin and Batima. My cousin made little effort to translate, but Batima was kind enough to keep me in the loop. The two men in lab coats, according to Batima, were representatives of a scientific organization that was looking for housing for their employees. They were interested in buying the property. The offered sum spread a smile across my cousin's face, yet Batima disagreed with it. Apparently, the place had more potential. I knew little of the financials, but I didn't like Dr. Barrett nor Professor Willow. I told my cousin I thought Batima was right and that I would not consent to a sale to the two men. When my refusal was translated to Professor Willow, like a child, he stormed out of my cousin's office. Dr. Barrett hung around for a while longer, gently prodding at my cousin with the promise of quick cash. But when it became clear the property would not be sold, he too made his exit. My cousin wasn't pleased with how negotiations had panned out, but Batima soothed his woes. The resort was, after all, doing well. If he would give her time, she could bring in even more revenue with a couple renovations and some investments. My cousin was reluctant, yet eventually, with a fair amount of prodding from me, he acquiesced. When the meeting was over, Batima walked me to my cottage.
I presume you're familiar with the stories they tell about nearby woods?
She asked as she lit up her hand-rolled cigarette. I told her I was.
And I presume you don't believe in them?
I told her I didn't.
Neither do I. But if I did, I would presume those two have business in that forest. I don't believe in children's fairy tales, but I wouldn't want to risk getting into bed with anyone from the...
It had been years since I heard the name. Each syllable of that terrible sound cracked through the cold air like invisible fireworks. I told her I agreed and thanked her for taking my side. The land was not sold to the two men in lab coats. Fatima kept her end of the bargain. Over the next half a year, my grandfather's homestead transformed once again. What was once a humble family resort became the Detox Zone. The walls got brighter, the decor took on a distinctly new age aesthetic, and the tranquil whistling of the wind was replaced with constant meditation music. The look of the resort was wholly foreign to me, and I disliked the breed of entitled people that would replace our old clientele. But Fatima kept her promise fully. The Detox Zone brought in significantly more revenue than we ever saw before. I retreated to my cottage, saved up my share of the profits, and watched the resort grow at a distance. Every once in a while, Fatima would drop by for tea and tell me tales of the bizarre questions the tourists would ask, but our friendship was sporadic and only experienced in short bursts. My cousin, on the other hand, would be at my cottage just about every week with a new bottle of expensive liquor. With every visit, he would reveal more plans for expansion and new avenues for his money to grow. Every visit, he offered to take me along for his investment ventures, and every visit I declined. There were moments when his talk of wealth and luxury had me doubting my resolve, but I am happy I kept my money safe. Were I to join him on his financial misadventures, I too would have ended up destitute. My cousin made some bad investments. A sizable chunk of his money went towards a locally produced hair loss product. In the same breath that he would bemoan all the lawsuits and his imminent financial ruin, the man would still swear by the hair cream. A lot of money was sunk. Some serious people were involved. My cousin needed cash quick. He didn't even ask. One morning, I simply found Professor Willow peeking into the window of my cottage. He had his face pressed up against the glass as if he were trying to spot an animal in a zoo. When he saw that I saw him, Willow's eyes filled with malicious glee. He grinned and waved and stood still for nigh a minute, and then he left. I barely pulled on my coat when my cousin barged into the room. He had made a deal, he assured me. A good payout. A really good payout. For the both of us, with a nice holiday bonus for Fatima. Willow offered him considerably better money, and since he knew I didn't want to leave the property, he even secured me ownership over the cottage. Willow was just going to house scientists. It would be a calmer affair than the rich hippies. My cousin assured me that what he did was necessary, and that I had no right to be angry with him. I didn't argue. I was angry, but my cousin looked to be on the edge of a nervous breakdown. I had seen the sort of business partners my cousin had. I knew he had little choice. I was displeased with my cousin's handling of the property, but by evening I found some solace in the idea of housing scientists. They would be, I hoped, a quiet bunch. I went to sleep that night presuming my life would not change much. Soon enough, however, I would meet the burnt people. It wasn't long after the detox zone cleared out that I started to feel uneasy at night. Back when the resort was still functional, there would be outdoor lighting to make sure none of the tourists stumble off into the wilderness. I quickly found myself missing those blinding lights. Each night, There was at least one moment I was certain someone was watching me from the darkness. According to the deal my cousin struck, I was still allowed access to my cottage, but the rest of the property was wholly off limits to me. The lobby of the resort was always guarded by a duo of tall men with shaved heads and a constant sneer on their face. At first, I thought I'd simply witnessed two twins on the same shift, but as the days passed, I always saw the same two faces. Another construction crew arrived at the resort a couple of weeks after the guards appeared. The crew was much quieter than anyone else who had ever worked on the property, and they would actively ignore me when I tried to make idle chatter. At first, I presumed that the crew was there to make adjustments to the resort rooms, yet very little of the original structure was touched. Instead, the work crew erected large black sheets above the resort, as if they were trying to hide something from satellites. The guards wouldn't say a word to me, and my cousin would never answer his phone. I was worried about what was happening on my grandfather's property. I was also worried about the lengthening absence of any communication with my cousin. What I truly should have worried about were the occupants of the new Detox Zone. The sound of footsteps on gravel woke me up. It couldn't have been more than 5:30. The sun was barely up. They were walking right by my window. At first, I thought I was still half in dream. Yet there were many of them, and the sight of them quickly sobered me. Outside of my window in a single file line walked dozens of scientists. They wore clean lab coats, and some of them even had spectacles, but they all had the complexion of corpses. The scientists were burnt beyond recognition. With some, their flesh was merely seared. With others, it was charcoal black. None of them looked like they should be walking. Most of them looked like they shouldn't be breathing. Out of a sheer sense of disbelief, I rose from my bed and peered closely from the window. I'd hoped that the terrible state of the procession would have just been some sinister trick of the light. It wasn't. Not only were there charred corpses walking by my window, they were also looking back at me. Some of them had eyes. Most of them did not. None of them stopped. They all had their heads turned towards me, but they still walked on in single file line. It was only the last scientist of the procession that properly acknowledged me. The man's eyeballs were shriveled, but I could not help but meet them. With a long, charred finger, he tapped on the glass. And then, with something that resembled a furrowed brow, he shook his head. I hid in my cottage until I was sure he was gone. Then, as quickly as humanly possible, I raced to my car and drove off to the city. I tried desperately to get a hold of my cousin. His phone was off. When I went to the hotel he used to stay at whenever he had business in the city, the receptionist said she had not seen him in months. I called Fatima. She met me a couple hours later at a cafe in the center. She still had a couple of hooks in her, but most of her jewelry was gone. Fatima was muted. Not soon after we sat down, she explained why. She had heard things about my cousin through the grapevine. Most likely he had lost more than money in his hair product deal. Fatima presumed the reason why I wanted to meet was because of my cousin. Though the confirmation of my fears stung, the events of the morning were much more pressing. Lowering my voice in an effort to contain my sanity, I told her about the burnt scientists. She listened without any judgment. Even when I talked about the charred cadaver tapping on my window, her face didn't twitch. She simply nodded, smoked her cigarettes, and took long sips of coffee whenever I struggled for words.
I presume your opinion on the stories of what happens in the forests has changed?
She finally said, when my terrible tale concluded. I nodded.
You aren't the only one,
she said as she finished her coffee.
We made some good money with the Detox Zone. I would suggest you take that money and move away from the property as soon as possible. You can't enjoy that money when you're dead. You can't enjoy that money when you're living near the...
The name of that terrible place once again crackled in the wind. I did not need Batima's advice to convince me. All her words did was assure me that I am not insane. I spent the next week in the city, taking a room in the hotel where my cousin once lived. For the first few days, I had made more attempts at calling him, yet his phone remained off. Eventually, I made peace with the likelihood of him no longer being among the living. After a week of hiding in the middle of the day, I made the drive back to my grandfather's property. I was not planning on spending the night or any extended amount of time in the cottage. All I wanted to do was to gather my belongings so that I would never need to see the place again. I, however, was not welcome. The mute guards met my car well before I entered the property. They said nothing and let the tips of their rifles draw all conclusions. I did not argue. I did not try to make my way back to the cottage to gather my belongings. I did not try to make my way back to the cottage, for it was burnt to the ground.
And so concludes another episode of the United People's Institute series. Next Thursday comes A Tale of Dreams, Lottery Numbers, and the Final Century, read by Jake Buckner. If you can't wait a full week for another episode, drop by patreon.com/MikeJLanger for the full 20-story season and a bunch of other early and bonus content. Also, if you haven't heard the first season of the United People's Institute series, there's a big old jumbo video of it down in the pinned comment for binge consumption. Big thanks to Alex Montyro for lending his voice to this tale, and Repulsive for providing the spooky tunes. If you're wondering why my voice sounds like this, it's because I was drinking with Alex and a bunch of other friends last night. Why was I drinking last night? Because I'm Czech and it's my birthright, but I was also celebrating. What was I celebrating? As of noon October 10th, I am cancer-free, baby, and very hungover. Really cherish all the love and care y'all have shown me over the past 2 months. Appreciate y'all. But you know who I appreciate the most? The patrons! Big old thanks to Daniel Wengel, Bob Condor, Dante Kincaid, Matt, Joyce, Mr. CreepyPasta, Kus, Christopher Brunda, C.R. Iptid, Nathan Hofstetter, Tara Mitchell, Gretchen Kelly, Dying Sun, Charlie Cooper, Paul Evans, Quiet Pills, Shion, and Jacob Verdon. If you want to join these illustrious scientific minds, drop by patreon.com/MikeJLanger. That's it for me this week. Hope everyone out there is safe, sane, and healthy. See y'all soon.